The next great leap in my life was that, like so many people, I fell in love with a classmate who was Trinidadian, Ashton, and we got married and I came to live in Trinidad. We had both done well as undergraduates, and the head of department, Douglas Hall, who I have to say, he's less celebrated than Elsa Guevara, but he was an absolutely wonderful man, a wonderful scholar, and an extraordinarily good head of department. He encouraged us both to do postgraduate work at the University of Toronto. He was a graduate of that university and had close links with the head. We actually both got scholarships. I got a scholarship from UWI, which in those days gave scholarships to do graduate work abroad. And Ashton got a scholarship from the Canadian government, what became CEDA, I forget what they called it then. So we both went to the University of Toronto and we both did MAs in history. After we graduated, although there was a possibility of staying,
by this time you were married to Ashton.
And had a baby, my first child. We are coping, both doing an MA. Well, we managed. It was easier as graduate students than if we had been full-time working. So we took him, if I remember, we took the baby to a neighbor for 4 mornings a week, and then with different class schedules, because we didn't do the same classes, we managed. The winter was more difficult to survive than coping with the baby and the classes. So we both did our MAs and decided to come back to Trinidad. First, I tutored at the Department of History for a year, but of course they all said you must do your PhD. So I signed up for a PhD at St. Augustine in '69.
Why did you decide to do your PhD on what eventually would become race relations in colonial Trinidad?
Right. Well, I have to introduce here another mentor after Elsa and Ward and Keith Lawrence and Douglas Hall. And this is Donald Wood. You would know that name. Right. Donald Wood was a wonderful British historian who wrote absolute classic Trinidad in Transition, the years after slavery.
Famous book we all
Famous
would have
book.
used.
I fell in love with the book. By the way, I had not then met Donald. I subsequently met him and became very close to him, but I hadn't then met Donald. I fell in love with the book. I thought it was such a wonderful book. I thought it was so different from conventional history. It was a work of social history. It was a work of cultural history. I thought it was an incredibly good book. I saw his sources, which were mainly sources he had in fact researched in Trinidad, and I thought I could do something like that. And obviously I would choose a period after he left off. His book, if you remember, covered 1830s to about 1870. So I thought that the last, that last third of the 19th century might be a good chronological period to try to do basically the same as Donald. And as people have seen, that race relations is modeled on Trinidad in Transition. I consciously saw it as a sequel to Trinidad in Transition. Subsequently, I must tell you, Donald played a huge role in my life. Whenever they needed someone to assess me, first of all, he was the reader of the book for Cambridge University Press. And then whenever they needed someone to assess me from whatever promotion I might have been up for, Donald always, so he's played a huge role. He was an absolutely wonderful man, which is why Kevin Yelvington and I co-edited a book in his honor. The Colonial Caribbean in Transition was done in his honor. So that's why I chose that period. That's why I chose to focus on social history. If you're looking at a late 19th century Caribbean colony and you're coming to it not as an economic historian or a political historian, but a social historian, race relations are likely to be one of your main approach.
Entry points. Yeah.
Entry point. Although, of course, class was equally interesting to me, and what the book tried to do was tease out the interrelationships between race and class, because, as you know, Caribbean history, and maybe Trinidad history even more than Jamaica or Barbados, has never been black and white. It's always been far more complex, and the way class intersected with race, or ethnicity as we now say, was far more complicated than at first one might have thought. So that's why my thesis was on that period and took that kind of approach. And I think it was actually Cambridge which suggested the title Race Relations. The title of my thesis was much more bland, A Social History of Trinidad, 1870 to 1900. I would have been quite happy with that as a book title, but I think it's
publishers have to get sexy titles.
Precisely.
There's something you said that interested me. You said that when you read Trinidad in Transition, Donald Woods, you felt it was a different history. So you're being introduced at this time, at your BA and ME, to history in a particular way.
Yeah.
History that was constitutional, economic, chronologies, narratives, and yet you felt you wanted, yet you were excited by a different history. What is it about your own makeup? Perhaps the fact that you've been well-read as a literary scholar, even if it wasn't a formal literary, that you think influences shape your history too?
It's a very good question, and let me just go back and say, to be fair, it's not that I wasn't introduced to social history as an undergraduate. Elsa Guevara was primarily a social history. So, I mean, I was getting quite a bit of that. And at the University of Toronto, at least one of my 3 courses was social history. Nevertheless, in this period, let's say the 60s, the new social history, as we call it, was only just being born, and conventional history was still very much chronologies, dates, wars, diplomacy, political, and economic history was big because of Marxism, obviously. So it wouldn't be true to say that when I read Trinidad in Transition, I was first introduced for the first time to social history. That wouldn't be true. But still, it did.
But there were no previous histories in the Caribbean written like that.
Well, perhaps Elsa's book would have, Slave Society in the British Leeward Islands would have been a bit of an exception. My models were Donald's book, and another model was Douglas Hall's book, Free Jamaica. Now that is mainly an economic history. Douglas was primarily an economic history, but there was quite a bit of social history there. I think you're absolutely right. I come to Trinidad from Jamaica. I need not tell you Jamaica and Trinidad are very different societies. I come now as a wife, a white wife, married into a very typical lower middle class black family. Ashton's family is from Sangre Grande. He's the second child, first son, and definitely the first to go anywhere near a university, and a typical scholarship boy. Yeah. So I'm coming into Trinidad in a different way. I'm a member of a mixed marriage. I'm giving birth to mixed race children and so on. I'm dealing with all of that. I'm a graduate student and a part-time teacher at this campus in the Black Power period. I have to deal with that too. My natural political instincts, I don't think I've ever been a radical, but they're liberal or left-wing, and yet I'm white and I'm English, and I'm living in a country and I'm on a campus with very strong anti-white feeling. This is late 60s, early 70s. I'm continually having to prove myself, and I had to do that, I would say, right through my 20s, 30s, and into my 40s. I had to prove myself that I was bona fide and on the level, despite being visibly white and manifestly of English origin and so on. So yes, I think absolutely that would have pushed me in the direction of being particularly interested in ethnicity and race relations and so on.
And that should be evident in the politics of your writing as well.
I would think so.
Because one of the things about race relations in colonial Trinidad, which is widely used today,
I know.
Still, is that it deals evenly. It almost attempts to look evenly at the existence of all these groups, all these different ethnic groups and classes. And so it doesn't attempt to position anyone as if it is, even if they occupy a superior position according to the hierarchy
of the day.
You've laid them out, and I think that's really important. But the other thing that I think interesting about the book, because I want to move us to looking at how your insights both, again, come back to your literary sensibility.
I forgot to say that. I'm glad you remind me of that. I have always read a great deal of fiction. I always have, from childhood up. I mean, to this day, my idea of relaxing is with a novel. I read a great deal of fiction, and I'm more and more interested in fictive narratives as they constitute our understanding of the past and so on. So although it's only more recently I have begun to think that this out in a more systematic way and write about it. I think my lifelong habit of reading fiction has also informed both my insights and I hope my writing style, which you had referred to earlier.
Yeah, I think it's something we definitely share because
I think
one of your books, or at least the one you work with Least
Yes,
Winery, Warner Arundel, Adventures of a Creole,
Yes.
certainly brings out that that aspect of looking at the biographical
Yes.
and seeing in history the roots of fiction, if you like,
Absolutely.
all the time.
Absolutely.
So we have this kind of literary feel because one of the things that, for instance, when I'm reading your race relations, the chapters, I don't just get the feeling of people's or events, but I get a good sense of how these took place, the level of rivalry sometimes,
yes.
the mood.
Yes.
And I think you're very good at pulling those things out.
The trick is to try to combine the more analytical and structural approach, which is typical of social history and social scientific history and annals type history.
Yeah.
Trying to combine that with what journalists call human interest stories and little anecdotes, which, although not in any way scientific or structural, bring the points you are making to life. So I think that when you're writing social history or cultural history, that's the balance that you have to achieve.
Yeah, because I think the thing is to see people in the midst of all this demographic.
To see people in the structures and the structures which are created by the people, and try to make your way through the structural approach and the more individual anecdotal approach.